she'll shake your windows and rattle your walls. But the times they are changing. Yes, they're changing.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of MindShift. I am your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. I am your fellow traveler along this road of deconstruction and discovery. This week's conversation is a great one. It is part 2 of the conversation that I had with one Seamus Clarke, which, of course, if you listen to last week's episode, you'll know is actually a pseudonym. That's not his real name. Why in the world would a guy come on a podcast but not use his real name? Well, if you remember, Seamus talked about last week, it's because he lives in the deep south, right in the middle of the Bible Belt in America. Not only is it a red state in that it overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump in the last election, there's also, of course, the stereotypical image that the words Bible Belt conveys. And as it turns out, it's actually a fairly accurate representation in many ways. This image of everybody goes to church in the South. Everybody's a Christian. Everyone just accepts that this is who you are. You've got this veneer of respectability, this veneer of Christian niceness and evangelicalism. There's a church on every street corner and sometimes 2 on every block. And this is the way it is. And everyone's a Christian and everyone's, this is the way it is. You're an American. You're a Christian. If you live in the South, especially the Bible Belt, this is all part and parcel of the culture, and he didn't feel that it was safe to come forward and kind of give his real name, as it were, and talk about who he really is. And what we heard in last week's episode was basically the beginning of his story of his own journey of deconstruction and discovery, and questioning a lot of the things that he was taught, and of course going through as a victim of childhood sexual abuse himself. And he talked about his own relationship with his father, who was the victim of abuse himself, and how that is passed along generation to generation and the effects that it has. Now, you take a situation like that, which is unfortunately all too common, but then you add this veneer, this layer of Christianity, this layer of evangelicalism, and you say the magic Jesus prayer. You wave a magic wand over it, and you expect everything to be solved, all the problems to be taken care of by God and by Jesus. But what happens, of course, is that it's not taken care of, and those deep-seated problems, issues, trauma, and all that from the past will just manifest themselves in a lot of other ways. And this is what we were talking about at the end of the episode, and this is where we pick up in this episode today, which I'm going to be bringing you in just a few minutes. Before we do that, I want to say real quickly that there's a couple of ways you can get a hold of me. I'm on Twitter at MindShift 2018. And I'm also on Instagram at MindShift Podcast. Also, if you would like to be a supporter of MindShift Podcast and help me take care of my monthly expenses in bringing you this podcast every Friday, then go to patreon.com/MindShift Podcast, and you'll find out more information about what it means for you to be a patron of this show. For as little as $1 a month, you can help support my work and help me to keep this podcast and my website, preachersforum.com/blog, going forward. And there's just a couple of other things I wanted to update you on real quick. I've created a Facebook group back in, I think it was November of last year, called the Post-Evangelical Writers Group. If this describes you, this is a great supportive network that we've created for people who identify as post-evangelical or post-fundamentalist, who want to explore what's going on out there in terms of their own writing, talking to other writers, people who are on this path, on this journey of deconstruction and discovery. And one of the really cool things that's come out of the Post-Evangelical Writers Group is that a bunch of us have decided that we want to work together, we want to collaborate on a book, and we're hoping to put that together this year and get some publishers interested in what we're doing. We're all contributing a chapter, and it's basically telling our story of coming out of fundamentalism or evangelicalism in the church. Many of us have grown up in the church, and this describes our journey coming out of this Christian thing, this Christian culture or subculture that we've grown up in or we've been exposed to. And so I am super excited that this project is taking shape. And in fact, I will mention that my chapter is something that I've posted on the private MindShift Podcast Facebook group, and you can read what I've written about how I was baptized 3 times and how that really messed me up growing up as a child. by being a patron of this show, and you can get access to that chapter. It's one of the rewards for being a supporter of this show. And the other thing I will mention real quick before we get into the second half of the conversation with Seamus Clarke is that I've recently started a YouTube channel, and I will put a link to that in the show notes. Every day I've been posting up an episode, starting with number 1 that I came out with this year, my pilot episode. So starting this last Sunday, I posted 1 episode, and I've been putting up 1 every day on my YouTube channel, the MindShift Podcast YouTube channel, until I get caught up sometime this week. And then I'll be coming out every Friday with my episodes, and they'll be coming out on the YouTube channel. And this is really cool because I'll be able to upload some other videos. I want to record some of the podcast recordings that I do with some of the other people that are coming up. And so this will be hopefully on the YouTube channel. In fact, speaking of upcoming guests, before we get to the interview with Seamus, I just want to mention what's coming up after his interview this week. And that is, for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be bringing you part 1 and part 2 of a fantastic conversation that I had with a friend of mine from Portland, Oregon. His name's Andrew Gurovich. In fact, we went to Bible college together. We went to seminary together in Portland, and we've kind of drifted apart, but come back together in the last 7 or 8 years on Facebook and stayed in touch that way. And this is an absolutely amazing conversation. He went from Christian evangelical, almost fundamentalist, to a complete angry atheist, and now he's becoming one of the world experts in Paleolithic rock art, cave art, ancient drawings in caves that are found all over the world, and what that means in terms of religion. And we have an absolutely unbelievable conversation. You do not want to miss part 1 and part 2 in the next couple of weeks with Andrew Gurovich. And also coming up, hopefully within the next month or so, I've been touching base with David Fitzgerald. He is an atheist. He's an author who wrote in 2010 a book called Nailed 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. He's also written in 2017 Jesus, Mything in Action, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. And we had a great conversation the other day, and I'm looking forward to finally recording with David Fitzgerald. We're going to be getting into the historicity of Jesus and what that means for everybody, really, but specifically really for Christians. Did Jesus even exist at all? Was there even such a person as Jesus? And we're going to find out what David Fitzgerald has to say on this subject. He's been researching and writing on this for over 20 years. So this is going to be another really thought-provoking and challenging conversation that I'm going to have with David coming up soon on the podcast. All right, so let's go on ahead and go into the conversation, part 2 with Seamus Clarke. If you recall, if you listened to last week's episode, and I would say if you haven't, you need to go back and check out part 1 with Seamus Clarke. We were talking about his family, his upbringing. He told the story of how he found out when he was about 14 or 15 how his grandfather had actually murdered his grandmother, and the effects that it had not only on his father, but on him as well, growing up, not knowing the whole story, but kind of feeling the effects of this dysfunction in his family. And of course, as I say, you add a layer, a veneer of Christianity over the top of the whole thing, and you've got a recipe for disaster. At least it was for Seamus. So in this week's part 2 episode, we're going to continue going on into this story of his family background and his own deconstruction and what it means for him to be unbuckling the Bible Belt here in the deep South of America. So let's go on into part 2 of my discussion with Seamus Clarke.
What happens is there's this dynamic. In my family, it was this generational inability to process emotion, to process trauma, and it plays itself out. So even though there was no communication about what happened, my father went through all kinds of abuse in his situation through the foster system and the orphanage, all kinds of abuse, sexual, emotional, verbal, you name it. But it's never talked about. Well, that stuff is there. Even though it's not addressed head on, it's there and you sense it and you just pick up on it somehow with no words being spoken. So when I got of age to where I kind of understood things a little bit more, kind of a coming of age, and I became more aware about life, became, conscious, I was very drawn to dark things. So the music I listened to, the films I watched, the books I read were very dark. They were traumatic, just that kind of brutal stuff, emotionally brutal stuff that I was seeking out because I was trying to process it. So it's like my father couldn't or wouldn't process it. And so I was trying to do it for him, if that makes sense. It's
Yeah,
really
yeah,
strange,
it
but
does.
that's what I think was happening. Like,
Yeah.
I knew something was wrong in his past, even before I knew it. And then when I did finally find out, of course, consciously it made sense. But like all that time, I'm trying to process underneath all of this shit that happened that is never dealt with. Because what's funny is, you know, there's a term, spiritual bypass. I learned about this through a podcast that I listened to several years ago. And then there was a book that was referenced, and I found the book. And it's just this idea of like, instead of facing things head on and being honest and just hitting it straight in the face, you bypass all those difficult emotions and subjects and experiences by going into the spiritual. So you might pray, you might worship, you might go to conferences, and all those things are a way to avoid and to just not come face to face with some of the really hard, dark, difficult things that have happened in your life. And this is really the model that my mom took. She's spiritual or a religious addict. You know, she's always at church, always going to conferences, always in prayer group every week. And this is where she gets her community and just her sense of like identity, her sense of self, her sense of empowerment. But still, all of these things that were happening in the house and all these things in the background of my parents, they just were never really confronted. And even when the whole thing came up to them about the sexual abuse that I went through, they really didn't acknowledge or process it. It was just immediately, hey, let's pray. And there was a quick prayer said that took about a minute and a half, and then it was over, and it was like, okay, we're good, we're done.
You're all
Moving
better
on
now.
And it's like, what?
Good old spiritual
Oh,
bypassing.
nothing.
I've never heard that term,
Oh,
but
man.
it's a great one. I can see as a model, I can see how that
So
system
true.
has worked. I mean, I used to go to pastors' conferences when I was a pastor in the States, and I think I shared with you when we were talking about this the other day about every time of these pastors' conferences, eventually over the course of the weekend, some pastor would confess to the rest of us that he was addicted to pornography or he was gambling the church's
Right.
money or whatever compulsive addiction it was. And the stock answer was get all the pastors around him, lay hands on him, pray for him. And then a couple other people would come forward and confess the same thing. And they'd go back to their churches on the Sunday afternoon, apparently thinking they were fine. Confessed it before their brethren
Oh.
and been prayed for. And everyone laid hands on them, and classic spiritual bypassing, as you say. And yet the issues, I would sit there in the back of the room and think, this is nonsense, man. I mean, there's no way they're going to be able to deal with all those deep-seated issues that are causing them to act out in these compulsive type addictions with just a quick prayer. I wish it was that easy. I really do. But it's not that easy.
Yeah, that'd be nice, right?
Yeah, it sure would be.
Yeah.
Just pray a prayer, it's like waving a magic wand. Basically, you might as well be Harry Potter or something like that and just, abracadabra, all your
Yeah.
problems are solved. And you hear these wonderful
Right.
stories about God curing people of their smoking addictions and alcohol. And so you think, well, I guess it's possible if God's all powerful. Why can't he just wave his magic wand too and fix me?
Yeah.
Without having to, like you said,
Well,
really go through the stuff.
Oh, man. Yeah. The crux of all that I've kind of just waded through mentally is like the whole issue is, especially in church, like I honestly feel really sorry for anybody who's a pastor. Like you have this impossible ideal to uphold that's just not going to happen. You can't be this person that you're supposed to be because you cannot be a human being. And so it's like there's an inability in the evangelical culture at large to be real or to be honest or to just be a human being, which means you're going to make mistakes. You're going to quote, quote, struggle. You're going to go through all these experiences because that's what everybody does. And I don't think really there's a distinction between someone who's quote saved and someone who's quote lost.
What's the
that whole
difference?
thing is a construct. I think it's a fabrication, and it creates this hierarchy of like who's in, who's out, this crazy binary where like, oh, well, I'm going to heaven and you don't know the Lord, so you're not. Yeah, right. Well, behind the scenes, if you look at both of the lives of these people, there's going to be a lot of contradictions. There's going to be a lot of things that don't match up because both people are human. That's the biggest thing for me that is a struggle is like this inability to grapple with the fact and to come to terms with the fact that you are a human being. So the whole way of understanding that the evangelical culture has about sin and like separation from God, it gets really problematic. And it causes a lot more trouble than it's solving anything. I mean, I found in college, I came across, as soon as I got out of the house, I watched all the films that I could never watch. And one in particular was The Last Temptation of Christ. I don't know if you remember that from growing up. I'm sure you do. There's a lot of hubbub.
I watched it. They picketed it at the theaters and everything. Yeah, they were angry outbursts, and evangelicals were banning the film and everything.
This is a funny story, but I think when that movie came out, it was probably like maybe 86. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think 86 maybe. Anyway, I signed a petition. So it got passed around our dinner table. I signed it. Like, what the hell? I don't know what this movie is. I'm told what it is by somebody like James Dobson or Focus on the Family or some other just sham type organization.
So it's clearly evil. Yeah.
What's that? Go ahead.
It's clearly evil then if Dobson says it's evil.
Yeah.
Oh, obviously.
And you trust him fully.
Oh, absolutely.
But I'm told to sign a piece of paper. I do it, and there you go. And what happens is the exact opposite of what they want to happen happens. They drum up a lot of publicity. The film gets watched more than it normally would, most likely, and they have done a self-defeating move. But all that to say is I signed the petition. Later, when I got out of school, I was on a film kick, of course. I was trying to go to film school, so I was very much into directors and watching their work. And I got onto Scorsese's work, and I watched Last Temptation of Christ. Well, it was a great film. I really loved it. The soundtrack was amazing by Peter Gabriel. The storyline itself was just fascinating to me because it showed the more human side of Jesus. So growing up, really, I saw Jesus more as like this person floating off the ground almost, that like wasn't somebody you could touch or relate to because he was so other, he was so supernatural.
He's Superman.
He was so much different than me. Yeah, like he's so much different from me. I couldn't really relate. I'm like, Jesus never thinks about sex. That's never mentioned in the Bible. So, I don't know how much I can even relate to this guy. I don't know. All these questions were brought up in the film, and then I ended up reading the book, which was excellent too. But that's the kind of thing that started me on the road to deconstruction, if you will. And I didn't even know what that term was at the time, but this was, 20 years ago when this happened. Or no, more than that. This was 93. This is 24 years ago.
Yeah.
And so even at that point, I was questioning, I was turning things over in my mind that were not acceptable in the church. And you just kind of deal with it privately. It's something you think about, but you wouldn't dare bring it up because you're going to feel the wrath of the people who are trying to protect themselves from these threats that come from the outside.
Oh, yes. I mean, I can relate to what you're saying. And I remember going to a conference and hearing Richard Rohr speak a few years ago up here in Sheffield in England. Yes. And he started talking about the first and the second half of life paradigm that he goes into. And it just blew my mind. And I thought, this is the path I've been on. I just didn't have the words to put it to. I realized this deconstruction process of mine, I was actually moving into the second half of life. And it kind of made me realize that I'm not crazy. This is a good thing to question a lot of the inherited dogmas and doctrines and things that I'd been taught growing up in Bible college, in seminary, that, you got to go back and go, wait a minute. I mean, how much of this can I actually keep? How much of this can I jettison and still be okay and actually become the person that I really am? Because as you say, in the church, we so often, we just put that mask on and we're not even true to who we are. We can't be. And certainly not if you're a pastor, as you say. I mean, I was a pastor for almost 12 years and I played the game. I tried so hard.
I'm so sorry.
And I look back on that guy. I say this to people all the time. I look back on that person that I was and I say to myself, I don't even know who that guy was. I really don't even know.
Yep.
Because the person I am today, I feel like bears almost no resemblance to that person who was up there preaching and trying to help people, trying to do all the right things, trying to live up, as you say, to those impossible expectations, and really knowing on the inside that I wasn't doing any of the things I was telling everybody else that they should be doing. So I knew I was a failure.
Right.
I just couldn't admit it. And it was a crazy system. My stomach was always in knots. I was always wound up and stressed and anxiety. What a terrible place to be as a pastor.
Yeah, it's not healthy. It's not mentally healthy. You have physical repercussions as well, with anxiety, and that stuff plays itself out in your physical body and in your mind and your brain. I mean,
exactly. It's going to come out somewhere. That's the thing, isn't it? You're going to act out somewhere, somehow, whether you're self-medicating with alcohol, gambling, pornography. I mean, that's the secret shame of so many pastors. They're addicted to all kinds of things that they have to keep it a secret from their flock of people. Because if they found out the truth, you'd be fired. You'd be sacked. You'd be out of there. And yet they can't open up and be real. Say, I'm struggling. I'm really having a hard time here. No, that's not allowed. You have to be perfect. They put you up on a pedestal and you have to be perfect. And it's like, no one can be that person. It's not possible. It's a crazy
it's
system.
Unsustainable. It
is.
It's an awful position. Like, I don't know. I'm sad that you had to do that just because, just like with any pastor, I mean, it's just impossible. There's no way you can keep that up and make it work.
Yeah, it's true. Well, but the going through those experiences, I feel like they've shaped me into the person that I'm becoming. So I'm grateful for the fact that I went through that, because that gives me a lot of stuff to speak out of that background, because I know what it's like to be in the trenches. I know what it's like to be in ministry full time for years and years and years. And when I was teaching, that was my real drive, was to equip men and women, because I would say to them, look, man, I know what it's like. I know what you're getting yourselves involved in here. People are heading into ministry. I would say, are you sure you want to do this? Because this can be the most thankless, brutal job in the world, So I wonder why I was laid off. I don't know in the end, but no, they ran out of money actually is what happened. But yeah, it's crazy.
Oh, man.
Now I'm want to loop back around. What kind of advice would you give for someone who's coming out of some of the same situations that you and I were in, but who hasn't gotten help, who doesn't know where to turn? Maybe that person's sitting in that church, they've been prayed for, but they've still got all the issues, the problems stuffed deep down inside. What would you say to that person? Where can they turn?
Yeah.
What's a good resource?
Yeah. Well, let's see. I would say a couple things. The fact that you are questioning and seeking and searching is a good thing. Like, that one thing about yourself that should not be stopped and really can't be. I don't think so. Like, you're going to try to heal and fix yourself in some way, because the primary drive of any human being is just to survive. The main thing you're trying to do is survive and propagate. That's at the basic level. That's what you're trying to do. So if there's something that's hindering you, you're going to seek out ways to find healing. Now, some of those are more effective than others. So if you're addicted to something and you're self-medicating, ultimately that's just going to be a kind of a loop, and nothing's going to necessarily be solved, but it's a way you're trying to fix yourself. For me, I found therapy very helpful, group therapy, and just, reducing shame. That was a huge thing for me, because shame is such a part of evangelical culture, and especially in the South, just getting in a room with other people who are dealing with the same stuff and just being able to talk honestly. That's the missing link that you don't find in churches, that you don't find among pastors. All these guys, like you said, you were trying to equip them for what they were getting themselves into. Well, really what you need is the ability to just be honest and to say exactly what's happening, and then that reduces shame. I would say as well, seeking, keep reading, search out people that you can talk to and be honest with. Of course, there's online groups like the, Evangelical is a great resource, but just finding somebody else who can resonate with where you're at, because there's people out there, like there's a lot more than you would imagine if you were sitting in a church. I know for me, when I think of church, I think corporately how everybody acts. There's a certain way, there's an expectation, what you're supposed to say, what you're supposed to do, yes, and everybody kind of goes along with it. The party line, if you will, like you said before. But if you were to ask everybody individually in that church about certain issues, or, what do you believe about this? I think everybody would give very different answers, because they would have the ability and the freedom to be honest, and it wouldn't match up. It wouldn't mesh together and be this monolithic thing that has to be the same and has to follow certain rules and certain ways that they're supposed to be or they're expected to be.
Yeah, the status quo.
So I would really encourage people to seek out forums where they can be honest, where they can question, where they don't feel they have to be certain all the time and have to regress to platitudes, because that really doesn't do anything for you.
It just makes the problem worse in a way, doesn't it? Platitudes, quoting Bible verses and whatever. You're actually just putting a Band-Aid on cancer or whatever it is. You can cover it up, with a, like you say, spiritual bypassing, but it doesn't actually attack the root issue that people are dealing with here. Yeah, I think, the thing about the church is too, one of the things about being involved in the evangelical group on Facebook is that it's opened my eyes more and more to the reality of how incredibly toxic the evangelical conservative culture, church cultures, particularly in America, but in this country as well, how toxic and damaging it can be to people's mental health.
Oh, hell yeah.
And so you throw that in there. I mean, I hear a lot of women talk about the whole purity culture thing. Women are shamed. Women are put down because they're not dressing modestly. They're causing men to stumble and they feel terrible about themselves.
Yeah.
And, this is a message that comes out in churches, doesn't it? Even now, you talk about abstinence and things like that. This purity culture, it's so incredibly psychologically damaging to women in particular. And this is the teaching that we're getting in churches. And it's warping these young girls. Yeah. It's messing people up big time.
It is, because it's putting this huge, mantle of responsibility on women in that type of ideology, purity culture, that it's their fault. It's their burden to bear to uphold the reputation of the men. Well, that's not true, and it's completely unfair, and it's psychologically damaging. It needs to go, but it's a stubborn thing, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's the person we're talking about, as well as the man or the woman that's been sitting in the church for years and years, and all the way home from church, all they do is rant about the things they disagreed with in the service and the sermon, because that was me for a long time. And I've heard a lot of people say that their girlfriend or boyfriend or partner would say to them, "Why are you even going anymore? All you do is rant all the way home about all the things that you're upset about."
Yeah.
And there's a reason why we got upset. The reason I got upset was I sat there and I listened to these people preaching and laying heavy burdens on people. And I think to myself, no, I don't own what you're telling me. And I see the damaging effect that it's having on other people. And it pisses me off, because I used to be that guy up there saying those things. And I know the effect that it has on people. And that makes me angry. It really makes me angry. And I had to walk away from the church for those kind of reasons, And so if talking to someone like you helps someone who's in that place but doesn't know where to turn or what to do, then it's a good thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And just to go back real quick about this whole idea of like ranting and raving, well, there's this tendency in churches especially to project, and that's a psychological term and a concept, but it's this whole idea of like, it just carries through what we've been saying the whole time. Like, if you can't look at yourself, if you can't deal with what's going on in your life, and you deny, you push away, you bypass, whatnot, you're going to point that out in somebody else and demonize and scapegoat them. And so that's what happens all the time. And that even infects the whole political climate that we're in now. This thing with Trump and conservatism that has just gone completely down the chute, and in my opinion. Yeah. And that's one of the main things that's caused me to make a conscious just split with the evangelical church, is the whole meshing of conservatism, evangelicalism, and just the way Trump behaves and acts, and how it's condoned and championed even. It's disgusting.
Yeah, I think that's true.
I don't know how much we're going to get into politics, or if you even want to, but that's a whole nother ball of wax, man.
Yeah, but I agree, because I think I've realized in this last year, that for me, that was the last straw of identifying with that brand of Christianity, was seeing the wholehearted support for Trump as a candidate and now as a president. And then people like Roy Moore and other people, even the sexual allegations and all that aside, these people are, they're liars. They weren't good candidates to begin with. And this, like you say, wholehearted veneer of Christianity, this cloak of respectability put on them, and yet they wouldn't condone that of their own pastor, I would hope, if they were sexually assaulting women or whatever, and yet they're voting for the guy and continuing to support him. And I said, you know what? That's it for me. That's it. I'm done. If that's what it means to be a Christian, then I don't want to call myself a Christian, because I'm not doing that. There's no way. And so I don't know where you're at.
And then the further Yeah. It's just a mess. It's a rabbit trail. And the further you delve into it, you see how it's all tied together with capitalism, with corporate America, with, I don't know, just the whole idea of the American dream and just what that means and the repercussions with economics, with how we treat different classes, or with even how we identify as Christians and kind of what we're going for. And if we are rewarded, you know, the whole prosperity gospel idea, God is happy with me, so I'm blessed financially. Just that it's all tied together, and I think Trump brings it to a head, and it's just, I just can't do that anymore.
Yeah, I think you're right. He actually embodies.
If that's the direction you're going, no.
Yeah, I read an article the other day that said actually Trump is not an anomaly. That's the whole thing. You've got to get your head around that. He's not an anomaly. He's actually just a figurehead for what was already there. He just is the voice for it. So that's what finally turned me off to, if you want to call it Christian evangelicalism in America, whatever. That was the final straw for me, because it's done is it's revealed what was already there, and I'm totally turned off by it. You know, so that's part of the deconstruction too.
Yeah, he brings to the fore authoritarianism, how you're just supposed to bend the knee to whoever's in authority, regardless. You don't have any kind of ability to be critical or to dissent from that. You're just supposed to follow lockstep with who's in authority.
Or it's fake
and
news.
then that brings up the idea of your position and power and hierarchy, all this stuff. And so these are things I never thought about. But once this election happened, and as I was already kind of really consciously in the stream of deconstructing, I've delved into this stuff and hit it head on. And now I just don't hesitate to look into these issues and to understand how they're all connected and related and how they play off each other. And it's a whole like underground root system in the American culture, and how it's played out in politics specifically is just crazy.
Yeah, and I think that's it. That might be a good kind of final word, isn't it? To say that this is all part and parcel of your deconstruction process, is that you and I too are questioning things that we would have never questioned 10, 20, 30 years ago, whatever it was, because we just accepted it.
Yep.
That's what a Christian is. That's what Christians believe, whether it's theologically, biblically, politically, whatever. And I just took this stuff all on board. And now I'm going, actually, not only do I not believe it, I actually see the toxic effects that it's having on people. And that's what, like I said, that's what makes me angry. And I want to speak out about it and say, look, you know, people are getting seriously damaged by this stuff. This isn't just rhetoric. This is affecting real people's lives, mental health, and immigrants and all kinds of things. It's playing itself out in the public sector, and we're part of it, whether we like it or not.
Yes. And really, just one final thought to just illustrate how the whole thing plays out. My dad is a huge Trump supporter. He's very conservative. He's the whole kit and caboodle of conservatism rolled up into one, and he's fully behind it. And he's even said, like, you know, I will always be the conservative. And so it's just funny to me because I see what he's been through, where he's come from, and I see like a lot of unhealed areas, and then toxically this plays out in politics, which affects real people, like you said, and the ramifications are very real. They play into our day-to-day lives. And so I don't know if I take my position a lot of times to be completely 180 degrees opposite of what he does, which is not necessarily healthy. But in this dynamic, I think it works because I just do not think that's a healthy place to be, and I don't like the outcome of what happens in that sphere of politics and being aligned with conservatism. I just cannot do that anymore. It just doesn't make sense. Yeah,
and conservative Christianity. Well, and this is part of moving into the second half of life. To put it back into Richard Rohr's model, you have to, the whole first half of life stuff is all about forming your identity. And when you start to strip those things away, it is hugely emotionally threatening. And I think that's one of the big reasons why people don't do it, is because they think, I can't lose the person I am. But actually, that's just a shell that you use to protect yourself. And actually, you need to go through the painful process. And that's why he says it's necessary suffering. Sometimes we have to go through suffering And that kind of wakes us up and we realize, wait a minute, I need to think about what I'm doing here. Is this who I want to be for the rest of my life? And if you say no, then you're on the path of deconstruction then. Well, listen, thank you so much, Seamus Clarke, the Irish guy from the South, for being a part of MindShift podcast. I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation. It's great to have been in dialogue with you about loads of stuff. We'll have to hoist a pint someday. If you come over, you can come to Ireland and we'll go to the Guinness Brewery. How about that? And have a nice Guinness there.
I want to so bad. I've been to Scotland once, and it was just transformative, beautiful place. I gotta get to Ireland.
Well, anytime you want to come visit. Well, thank you very much for being on the podcast. I will talk to you, Thanks sure, again. Well, thanks once again to Seamus Clarke, that nameless Irishman from the deep south of America. What a great conversation. One thing that strikes me as I go back and listen to the recording that we did is basically what we're hearing is one man's deconstruction. And as he talks about why it wasn't safe for him, or he felt like it wasn't safe for him and his family to use his real name. And that's kind of a sad statement, isn't it? That in this day and age, and I said this last week, in this day and age, that a person, a grown adult with a family who's been married for years, doesn't feel safe to talk about where he's going in terms of questioning all the things he was taught. Just like me, a man who grew up in this cradle of Christianity, going to Christian school, going to church from day one, graduating from a Christian high school, going off to Bible college and seminary, being a part of the system for so long. But of course now he's questioning everything, and he's in the process of walking away from a lifetime of church and Christianity and all the things that made up his very identity. And this is very emotionally threatening, isn't it? And while we're on this subject of talking about one person's deconstruction, one person's journey away from evangelical and fundamental Christianity, one thing that struck me as funny today, I was working on a job site, putting a kitchen in a house. I do a lot of building work, and that's how I make my living now, since I got made redundant from my teaching job a couple years ago. But I was working away, putting in this kitchen, and there was an electrician there, and I've known this guy. We've done a lot of different jobs together. And when we all sat around at lunchtime, we got to talking, as you do. And I had mentioned to him before on the last job we worked on about this podcast, and he was asking me how it was going and what kind of subjects and things that I cover on the show. And I was telling him about some of the episodes that were coming up in the next few weeks, with Andrew Gurovich and David Fitzgerald and some of the other things. And we got into this subject. He was asking me about this historicity of Jesus, which we're going to be getting into with David Fitzgerald. And we were talking about that. And I began to talk about some of the other things that we've covered with this problem of evil, which I covered with David Madison a while back. And what was funny about the conversation was that the more I explained to him these things like the problem of evil and some of these other issues that have plagued Christianity for literally centuries, he had this really funny look on his face. And he asked me, he said, is this the kind of stuff that Christians really believe? Is this the kind of stuff that Christians are really worried and upset about? And I said, yes, absolutely. And he was asking me, well, where is Christianity going to be, do you think, in the next 100 years, 200 years? And I said, look, Christianity's not going to go away. There's been many, many times when Christianity's demise has been predicted by one person or another. They've said, look, Christianity's going to be going the way of the dinosaur. There was the movement back in the 50s, 60s, the God is dead movement that predicted the end of Christianity. There was the classic secularization thesis, which predicted that with the rise of science and technology and all the wonderful things that we enjoy in our world, that we just simply won't need God anymore, and we just won't need Christianity. We won't need any religion, really, for that matter. But my answer to this electrician was, I said, one thing that history shows us for sure, when we look at the history of humanity for thousands of years, every different culture all over the world, humanity is incurably religious. There's always been gods and goddesses. People have always been interested in spirituality, and religion has been a part of virtually every culture, even going back, and this is something that Andrew Gurovich and I are going to be talking about in a couple of weeks. We're getting into this issue of Paleolithic rock art, stuff that dates back 20, 30, 40,000 years ago. And what does it mean in terms of ancient religion, ancient spirituality? What do these images evoke? what sort of emotions and feelings do these images evoke, and what does it say about our very nature as human beings, stuff that we share in common across all cultures. People have always been interested in religion and spirituality, so I said Christianity is not going to go away, because he was thinking, well, it's all going to just die out, isn't it? But I don't really believe that that's the case, and I'm not trying to destroy Christianity. I'm not trying to, talk you out of being a Christian if that's what you are. That's fine. You have your beliefs, and that's what it's all about, is getting comfort and community, as Seamus said. What his mother does, she's a religious addict, but that's where she gets her sense of community, and it seems to work for her, although, of course, we did note that there was a lot of toxicity that comes out of these sort of addictions, the spiritual bypassing that we talked about, and these are some of the dangers within Christianity. And it's not just Christianity, of course. Every religion has its share of problems. Every religion has its issues and problems that it's got to deal with. So Christianity in that sense is not unique. But I think what is good, if you're a person that's in the church, if you're a person like Seamus and myself in many ways who came out of that culture, this conversation is especially relevant. And for someone like my electrician friend, he was just looking at me with this funny look on his face. He couldn't believe the kind of stories and the kind of things I was telling him. But I said, it's true. This is the stuff that Christians believe. This is the stuff that really winds Christians up. And these are the things that, I guess, keep some awake at night worrying about some of these problems. And so if I can help you to, maybe go along that road of deconstruction and discovery, I'm more than happy. I'd love to hear from you. You can drop me a line on multiple different platforms in terms of social media. As I said before, you can find me on Twitter at MindShift 2018. You can also get a hold of me on Facebook if you drop by and like the MindShift podcast Facebook page. You can also follow me on Instagram at MindShift Podcast. And you can drop by my website, preachersforum.com/blog. Check out some of the articles I've written. And you can also get a hold of me on the website as well by leaving a comment, and I'll respond to you there. You can also subscribe to my Theology Corner page, and I've included a link to that in the show notes as well. I'm always posting new articles on there. And of course, I always publish my podcast on Theology Corner too, so you can subscribe to that and stay in tune with what I'm doing. All right, so I'm going to let you go now. I just want to remind you that coming up next Friday, be sure and catch my conversation, part 1 with Andrew Gurovich. We want to find out, how does a guy go from a Christian, an evangelical Christian, to angry atheist, to now a world-leading expert on Paleolithic rock art? This is going to be an amazing conversation, so be sure and come back next Friday for my conversation with Andrew Gurovich, part 1, right here on MindShift.
Yes,